So right after 9/11, one of the phrases that was being used a lot was 9/11 changed everything. So let's think about that for a minute. Obviously it was a PR phrase, and obviously 9/11 didn't change everything, but let's just at least think about one or two things that it did change. And let's also reflect upon this whole issue. What did 9/11 change? Start with something quite obvious. 9/11 certainly moved the world's Muslim populations into the crosshairs of the US military. Not to say that they'd been entirely out of them before, but this time they became central. 9/11 was scripted as a Muslim action. Okay? Now let me explain what I mean. I don't mean that this horrendous crime represents true Islam or the best of Islam. Obviously not. But I'm saying that whoever scripted this wrote Islamic symbols and so on into the action so thoroughly that most populations in North America and Western Europe certainly would immediately identify this as Islamic and would say this is Muslim extremism and it's a big danger. Let me give a few obvious examples. For most people in North America, if they hear about hijacking of planes, I think that they think right away of Arabs and Muslims as doing it. It probably goes back to the early days of hijackings when Palestinians were involved in a number of incidents. I think also when they hear of suicide attacks, for sure, they think, oh, Muslims did that, extremist Muslims did that. Again, this is not necessarily accurate historically, but most North Americans wouldn't think immediately of, say, the Tamil Tigers and their pioneering work in suicide bombing. They would immediately think Muslim extremists. So what do you have on 9/11? You have hijacking of airplanes, that's part of the script. You have an enormous, almost like the ultimate suicide attack, and all of this is screaming Islamic extremism to most North Americans. You have also all kinds of little symbols. The Quran casually left in, I believe it was the trunk of someone's car, along with an Arabic flight manual. All kinds of terrorist paraphernalia discovered on the crime scenes, sometimes in quite absurd ways. Flight 93 apparently hits the ground so hard that the plane disappears into the soil, an extraordinary notion, and yet the site is littered with terrorist paraphernalia. Headscarves were found on the ground, supposedly indicating a particular Islamic sect, terrorist knives, terrorist business cards. Of course, I'm not going to pursue this line here, but it's this kind of nonsense that leads many of us to say this was a staged crime scene. In a homicide investigation, if a homicide victim has been set up by the perpetrator to look like a suicide, we call that a staged crime scene. And investigators have to be experienced at exposing that. In my view, it's pretty clear that all the crime scenes on 9/11 were staged crime scenes. But regardless of who you think scripted 9/11, whether it was Osama bin Laden or whether it was people who did it within the recesses of the US intelligence and military network, which I think is the case, whoever did it scripted it to say loud and clear to North Americans, but this was Muslims that did this. So Muslims moved into the crosshairs in that sense. Also, a very strange thing happened in 9/11 where bin Laden's group, Al-Qaeda, was really took on the mantle of leading US enemy, which used to belong to the Soviet Union during the Cold War. And the Soviet Union did actually present an existential threat to the United States, by which I mean it could have wiped out, it could have destroyed the existence of the United States as a state and as a functioning society within 2 hours with its ICBMs, long-range bombers, and so on. Well, Americans sort of got used to living under that existential threat, but in the end, the Soviet Union did not attack the American homeland. What happened in 9/11 is that a successor seems to have been chosen to the Soviet Union, and strangely, it's a small, non-state actor with no Navy, no Air Force, no Army, no ICBMs to lob at the United States, But how it gains its credibility as the successor to the Soviet Union on 9/11 is that it does successfully attack the U.S. homeland, in a way for the first time in history. And it does it through what the U.S. military now calls asymmetric warfare, which is a fascinating notion that somehow the weak, if they're underhanded and wily and clever enough, can actually destroy and achieve victories over the strong. And this notion allows the United States, by far the strongest power in the world militarily, to now present itself as weak and as the victim. And that is part of the script of 9/11 as well. So suddenly Al-Qaeda, an example, a representative, if you like, of Islamic extremism, takes on the mantle of the Soviet Union and becomes the center of international terrorism everywhere. So in these respects, 9/11 really did put Islam in the crosshairs. If you ask me, is this really a crusade, a religious crusade that the United States and its allies are on as they attack Muslim countries, as they attack Afghanistan, Iraq, as they threaten Iran, as Israel, one of the allies of the United States, bombs Syria, as the United States now attacks Pakistan? Is this a kind of ideological fight? I would say there's some of that going on, and certainly that's used to mobilize the populations of the West, this demonization of Islam. So the kind of predictable and tacky underlying motives, I think, of U.S. actions are geopolitics and energy resources, meaning especially oil and natural gas. We are, as I'm sure everyone, well, most people know, entering this period of peak oil, meaning that the world's resources of cheap oil have been used up to about the halfway point, and from here on in we're going to be in trouble as world demand exceeds supply. There's going to be a lot of scrambling and competition for this, and it's already begun. Polls taken as the U.S. attacked Iraq in 2003 show that most people in the Middle East knew this clearly, that the motivation of this attack was not to bring democracy or defend the United States. It was about oil. I think they were right. Okay, so 9/11 didn't change everything, but it, as I said, certainly led to Islam being targeted and Muslims being targeted. I'd like to say a word now about 9/11 itself and the events of it. Who did it, and does that matter? I'm always amazed to meet people that think it doesn't matter who did it, and that I'm wasting my time trying to figure that out. To me it matters a great deal. If they're able to pull this off as a false flag operation, in other words to portray it as done by Al-Qaeda when in fact it's done by insiders in the United States, who's to say we aren't going to wake up tomorrow and have them do it to us again? If they can fool us once, fool our best intellectuals, fool our dissident journals, our universities, we could wake up tomorrow morning and find that there was an incident in the Strait of Hormuz and suddenly Iran needs to be attacked. Seymour Hersh said last year that Cheney had already a list of 12 possible options for triggering a war with Iran, and a false flag operation in the Strait of Hormuz was one. So we need to figure out how 9/11 was done, and how more generally to discover when one of these fraudulent events, fraudulent triggers for war is taking place. That leads me to my final comments on what we should do. We need to develop not only a critical ability, but an investigative ability in civil society, so that we won't have to depend upon our major media or even our universities. We'll be able to do the investigation, discover what's happening, and communicate that effectively. And this isn't an advertisement for the Canadian Charger, but I think this particular initiative is very exciting, and I hope it will be further developed and it will go some way toward fulfilling this need.